There are people in history who almost refuse to fit inside the boxes we build for them. Every generation looks at them and sees something different. Some see a hero, others see a villain. Some see a visionary, others see someone who simply abandoned their responsibilities. And every few decades, historians dust off the evidence, argue over the same letters, the same dictionaries, the same eyewitness accounts, and somehow walk away with entirely different conclusions. Queen Christina of Sweden is one of those people. Was she one of Europe's greatest intellectuals, a selfish monarch, a woman centuries ahead of her time, a religious fanatic, a political genius, someone trapped by expectations they never chose? Maybe she was all of those things. Or maybe history simply doesn't like people who refuse to be easily explained. Now just imagine standing inside the Great Hall of Uppsala Castle. It is June 6th, 1654. The room is filled with the most powerful people in Sweden: nobles wrapped in velvet, bishops dressed in black, counselors who have spent decades helping build one of Europe's most powerful empires. Hundreds of candles flicker against the stone walls. Melted wax drips onto the floor. Heavy wool and damp leather fill the air with an unmistakable scent of too many people gathered in one place. And beneath all of it, tension. The kind of tension that settles over a room when everyone knows they are about to witness something that should have never happened. At the center stands a woman of 27. She isn't physically imposing. She isn't wearing armor. She isn't surrounded by soldiers. Yet, for the last 10 years, she has ruled an empire stretching from the Arctic almost to the heart of Germany. She inherited the throne as a child after her father, Gustavus Adolphus, died on a battlefield that changed European history. She ended the war that made Sweden a great power. She filled her court with philosophers. She rejected every prince Europe offered her. And today, she is about to do something unimaginable. She's going to give away the crown that millions of people would have killed to wear. Think about that for a moment. We really don't have a modern equivalent. Imagine someone walking away from being president, walking away from being prime minister, walking away from leading one of the most powerful countries on earth. None of those comparisons are really enough because Christina wasn't resigning from a job. She was surrendering the identity that she'd been raised to become since childhood. One by one, the symbols of that identity are removed. The crown is lifted from her head. The heavy mantle is collapsed from her shoulders. The scepter leaves her hand. The orb, the sword, piece by piece, everything that made her queen disappears. Imagine standing there while the weight you've carried your entire life is literally lifted away from your body. She had prepared a speech. She had rehearsed this moment, but when she opens her mouth, nothing comes. The woman who debated Europe's greatest philosophers, the woman who argued with generals and bishops, the woman raised from infancy to think like a king, breaks down. She cries openly before the entire Swedish court, not because she regrets leaving, but because no matter how certain you are that you're making the right decision, walking away from everything you've ever known still hurts. Eventually, she gathers herself. She says her farewell. She walks out of the castle, out of Sweden, and into a future no one could have predicted. Freedom, exile, perhaps both. But here's the question I always come back to. What kind of person willingly gives up absolute power? More importantly, what kind of life makes someone believe that giving up everything is the only way they can finally become themselves? Welcome back to Beyond the Swedish Postcard. Last time, we stood on a battlefield outside the little town of Lutzen. We watched the fog roll across the fields. We watched cavalry disappear into smoke. We watched one of history's greatest battlefield commanders, Gustavus Adolphus, charge into the chaos and never come back. His death changed Sweden forever. But here's the thing about history. Battles don't really end when the fighting stops. The consequences keep unfolding, sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries. Today, we are following one of those consequences. Because when Gustavus Adolphus died, he didn't leave behind an adult heir ready to take command. He left behind a 6-year-old daughter. Imagine that. One day, you are a little girl playing with toys in the halls of Kronor Castle. The next, every noble in the kingdom is bowing to you. Every decision made in your name affects millions of people. Every foreign ambassador studies your face, wondering what kind of ruler you'll become. Every prince in Europe suddenly sees you as a political opportunity. You don't get to have a normal childhood anymore. You don't even get to grieve because the country needs a monarch, and you happen to be next in line. Now, on paper, Christina inherited one of the strongest kingdoms in Europe. Sweden controlled vast territories around the Baltic. Its armies were feared across the continent, and its influence stretched deep into Germany. But power on paper and power in reality are often very different things. She inherited an empire exhausted by war, a treasury under constant strain, a court that expected her to rule like her father, while also expecting her to behave like every other woman in the 17th century. Those two expectations were impossible to reconcile. And that's really what today's episode is about. Not simply the life of Queen Christina. It's about expectation, it's about identity, it's about what happens when the role the world gives you doesn't fit the person you are. 400 years later, we're still asking those same questions. And maybe that's why Christina still feels surprisingly modern. Let's start at the beginning, or rather, let's start in the room where the beginning happened, because the story of Christina's birth is not just a biographical detail, it's a miniature of everything that followed. It is December 8th, 1626, Stockholm. Kronor Castle, the royal palace, a sprawling stone fortress on the island where the old town meets the water. The dark winter has already swallowed the city by mid-afternoon. Inside the castle, in the queen's chambers, Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg is in labor. She is 27 years old. She's been married to Gustavus Adolphus for 6 years. She's already suffered at least one miscarriage, possibly more. The pressure to produce a living heir is immense, and she knows it. Everyone knows it. The room is crowded. Midwives, ladies in waiting, physicians. The air is thick with the heat of a roaring fire and the specific anxiety of a royal birth. In the 17th century, childbirth was not a private medical event. It was a political spectacle. The future of the dynasty hung on what emerged from the queen's body. Courtiers waited in the corridors. Messengers stood ready to carry news across the kingdom and beyond. If it was a boy, the celebrations would be immediate and extravagant. If it was a girl, well, there was a reason the tension in that room was thick enough to cut. The labor is long and difficult. Hours pass. Maria Eleanor's strength ebbs, but finally a baby emerges, and it is big, strong-limbed, and it lets out a cry that fills the room. The midwives, in the chaos of the dim light and desperate hope for good news, make a declaration that will echo through the rest of this child's life. It's a boy. The word spreads like fire. A prince, an heir. The messengers are dispatched. The cannons begin to be prepared for salute. The court breathes a collective sigh of relief. The Vasa dynasty, the new dynasty, the one Gustavus Adolphus's father had fought to establish, will continue. Sweden will have a king. And then someone looks closer. Imagine the silence that falls in that room. The lead midwife, perhaps wiping the child clean, checked the sex more carefully and realized with a cold rush of horror that a mistake had been made. The child is not a boy. The child is a girl. The words that had just been sent out to the world were wrong. The heir to the throne of Sweden, the child of the Lion of the North, the future of the Protestant cause in Europe is female. In a different court with a different king, this might have been a disaster. There were plenty of monarchs in European history who would have raged or blamed their wives or seen the birth of a daughter as cosmic punishment. But Gustavus Adolphus, when he is told, does something unexpected. He laughs. She will be clever, he says. She has already deceived us all. And then he gives an order that will define Christina's entire life. She is to be raised as a prince, not disguised. Everyone will know she's a girl, but educated, trained, prepared for power. She will learn what kings learn. She will be fitted for a crown. Now, pause here and think about what this really means. On the surface, it is a remarkably progressive act for a 17th century monarch. Gustavus Adolphus is, in effect, saying that his daughter's sex will not prevent her from ruling. In a world where women were considered inherently unfit for sovereignty, this is almost radical. But look at it from a child's perspective. From the moment of her birth, Christina's identity is defined by a contradiction. She is a girl, but she is being raised as a boy. Her value is tied to the fact that she is not like other girls. Her intelligence, her strength, her refusal to show weakness, these are the qualities that make her acceptable. But they are also the qualities that make her unnatural in the eyes of her culture. She is being praised for being exceptional, but the standard she is being measured against is male. She can never fully succeed at being what she is being trained to be because she can never fully be male, and she can never fully accept what she actually is because what she actually is, a woman, has been defined as insufficient from the moment she drew her breath. This is the box Christina is placed in at birth. It is a gilded box, a royal box, but it is a box, and she will spend the next 27 years trying to figure out how to live inside it, and then the rest of her life trying to break free of it entirely. The christening is held a few weeks later. The child is named Christina after her paternal grandmother. The court puts on a brave face. The official line is that the king is delighted with his daughter, and he is genuinely by all accounts. Gustavus Adolphus loves this child. He visits her often, he plays with her, he dictates the terms of her education personally, but he also knows, as everyone knows, that a female heir is a fragile thing. The succession is not truly secure until there is a son, and Maria Eleonora's health is fragile. The pressure will continue. For now, though, the baby arrives. She is strong, curious, and quick. The king looks at her and sees a future. What he cannot see, because no one can, is that he will be dead in 6 years, and that this child, this girl who was briefly a boy, will be left alone to carry the weight of everything he built. Every child has a moment that divides life into two parts, before and after. For Christina, that moment came in November of 1632. She was 6 years old. 6. Old enough to remember her father's laugh, young enough to still believe that parents are invincible. Hundreds of kilometers away, somewhere in the thick morning fog outside the little German town of Lutzen, Gustavus Adolphus rode into battle. If you listened to the last episode, you know what happened. The smoke swallowed him, his men lost sight of him, and when they finally found him, the Lion of the North was dead. News didn't travel quickly in the 17th century. There were no telephones, no radio, no newspapers delivering breaking headlines the next morning. The message rode north on horseback, crossing forests, frozen rivers, villages already scarred by decades of war. By the time it reached Stockholm, Sweden, it already changed forever. Imagine that moment. Somewhere inside Trey Kronor Castle, someone has to tell a 6-year-old little girl that her father is never coming home. We don't know exactly how that conversation happened. History rarely records moments like that. But we know what came next. And what came next feels almost impossible to comprehend. Christina's mother, Maria Eleonora, didn't simply mourn. She unraveled. Even before Gustavus died, contemporaries described her as intensely emotional, deeply devoted to her husband, and prone to dramatic swings in mood. His death seems to have shattered whatever stability remained. She refused to let him go. Literally, Gustavus Adolphus' body remained above ground for more than a year while preparations for his burial dragged on. And then there was his heart. Removed during embalming, placed inside a silver casket. Maria Eleonora kept it close to her. Think about that. Not a portrait, not a lock of hair, his heart. Court servants later described rooms draped entirely in black cloth, candles burning day and night, curtains closed against the sunlight, the air thick with incense, wax, and the chemicals used to preserve a king's body. It must have felt less like a palace and more like a mausoleum. And somewhere inside those dark rooms was 6-year-old Christina. Imagine trying to understand death at that age. Imagine your mother carrying a silver box that everyone whispers about. Imagine hearing crying through the walls every night. Imagine adults lowering their voices every time you enter the room. Today, we'd probably recognize Maria Eleanor as someone suffering profound psychological trauma. 17th century Europe didn't have that vocabulary. They simply believed she had lost her mind. Whether that's fair or not, the people governing Sweden reached the same conclusion. They looked at the grieving widow, they looked at the frightened little queen, they made a decision that would change Christina's life for a second time. They took her away. Just think about the sequence of events. Within a span of roughly a year, she loses her father, she loses her home, she effectively loses her mother. But before she's old enough to understand any of it, she's already learned one piece of history's cruelest lessons. Power doesn't protect you from grief. Christina was placed in the care of her aunt, Catherine of Sweden, where she would finally experience something resembling stability. But childhood had ended. The little girl who adored her father was gone. In her place stood a child carrying the expectations of an empire. Christina lost her parents, and books became her family. It's one of history's strange ironies. The little girl who had lost almost everyone she loved found comfort in something that couldn't abandon her: knowledge, ideas, words written by people who had been dead for centuries. Because while other children were learning etiquette or embroidery, Christina was being prepared to rule an empire. And that meant her education wasn't just unusual, it was almost unprecedented. The man responsible for much of it was Axel Oxenstierna. If Gustav Adolphus built Sweden's empire with armies, Oxenstierna built it with administration. It was difficult to overstate how important he was. He wasn't merely the kingdom's chancellor. He was the architect of modern Sweden, the man who somehow held the empire together after the death of its greatest king. Imagine the responsibility resting on his shoulders. The future of Sweden depended on a little girl, a girl who would one day inherit not just a throne, but one of the largest military powers in Europe. So Oxenstierna made a remarkable decision. If Sweden needed a ruler, then she would receive the education of a ruler, not the education normally given to princesses, the education given to princes. That distinction mattered more than we sometimes appreciate today. In 17th century Europe, education wasn't simply about learning facts, it was about deciding who was worthy of power. Princes studied languages so they could negotiate treaties, philosophy so that they could understand justice, history so they could avoid repeating disasters, military strategy because someday armies would march under their command. Princesses were generally taught something very different: marriage, religion, household management, court etiquette. Their education prepared them to support power, not to wield it. Christina crossed that line. She studied Latin until she could write and debate with Europe's finest scholars: Greek, Hebrew, French, German, Dutch, Italian, Spanish. She read Plato in the original Greek, Aristotle, Tacitus. She immersed herself in theology, philosophy, politics, economics, astronomy, and military history. By her teenage years, ambassadors arriving in Stockholm weren't just meeting a queen, they were meeting one of the most educated people in Europe. Think about that. Not one of the most educated women, one of the most educated people, period. But here's what fascinates me. Every lesson Christina received carried two messages. The first was obvious: you must become wise enough to rule. The second was quieter: you are different. Every language she mastered, every philosopher she read, every debate she won reminded her that she was living a life almost no other woman was allowed to live. Imagine growing up knowing you're exceptional, while also knowing the society around you believes women shouldn't have the power that you're being trained to exercise. That's an impossible contradiction. And contradictions have a way of shaping people. Christina became intensely curious, restless, hungry for ideas. She reportedly slept only 4 to 5 hours at night because she'd rather read than sleep. Knowledge wasn't simply useful to her, It became part of her identity. If she couldn't choose the circumstances of her birth, she could choose what filled her mind. But there was another contradiction waiting for her. The very same men who applauded her brilliance expected that one day she would set her books aside, marry, produce children, and quietly become what every queen was expected to become. Christina wasn't interested, not even a little. And before long, that quiet disagreement would become one of the greatest political battles of her reign. There was one question Christina could never escape. It followed her through council meetings, through diplomatic dinners, through letters from foreign courts, through conversations with bishops, through nearly every stage of her adult life. When are you going to marry? Today, that question can be annoying. In the 17th century, it was a matter of state. Remember, Christina wasn't simply a woman, she was the monarch. And monarchs didn't really belong to themselves. Their marriages weren't private, their children weren't private, even their bodies weren't entirely their own. Everything was political, every smile, every conversation with a foreign prince, every rumor whispered through the courts of Europe. Imagine growing up knowing that one day the most important decision of your life wouldn't be yours to make. It would belong to someone else. That's the world Christina inherited. Ambassadors arrived from across Europe carrying portraits of eligible princes. Every kingdom saw opportunity. If their prince married the Queen of Sweden, influence followed, alliances followed, perhaps even control. But Christina saw something different. She saw a trap. Think about her options. If she had married a foreign prince, Sweden risked becoming entangled in another nation's ambitions. Foreign advisors, foreign loyalties, foreign expectations. The independence her father had fought so hard to secure could slowly begin slipping away. But marrying a Swedish noble wasn't much better. Suddenly, one family would stand above all the others. Rivalries could explode. Nobles who had tolerated one another for decades might suddenly find themselves competing for influence through the queen's husband. There really wasn't a perfect choice. And then there was something people often forget: marriage itself. Today, we think of marriage as a partnership between equals, at least in principle. In Christina's world, it wasn't. Under 17th century law, a wife was expected to obey her husband. Think about the absurdity of all that. The Queen of Sweden expected to submit to someone else. Even if that expectation wasn't always followed in practice, it existed. Christina understood exactly what that meant. The moment she married, people would begin to ask a different question. Not, what does the Queen think, but what does her husband think? She had spent her entire life being educated to rule. Why would she voluntarily surrender that? And then there was childbirth. We often forget just how dangerous it was. Today, it's easy to take modern medicine for granted. In Christina's lifetime, giving birth could be a death sentence. Queens died. Peasant women died. Noble women died. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. She knew exactly what was being asked of her. It wasn't simply have children. It was risk your life for the dynasty. So when Christina wrote her autobiography, I have an insurmountable aversion to marriage, historians have spent centuries trying to explain what she meant. Was it fear, a desire for independence, religious conviction, a lack of attraction to men, some combination of all those? The answer is we don't completely know. Human beings are rarely motivated just by one thing, but we do know this: she never changed her mind. Not after years of pressure, not after endless negotiations, not after sermons from the clergy, not after advice from her closest advisors. Christina refused. Eventually, she reached a compromise. She named her cousin Carl Gustaf as her heir. Sweden would have its next king. The succession would be secure, but she would not marry simply because everyone else believed she should. Looking back 400 years later, it's tempting to see that as inevitable, almost obvious, but imagine how extraordinary that decision must have seemed at the time. Here was one of the most powerful women in Europe telling an entire continent that her life would not follow the script they had already written for her. That wasn't simply unusual, it was revolutionary. If there is one part of Christina's life that continues to spark debate, it's this one: 400 years later, people are still asking the same question. Who was Christina? Not Queen Christina, not the ruler, the person. It's a surprisingly difficult question to answer because every generation tends to see Christina through its own eyes. Victorians saw eccentricity. 20th century historians often saw psychology. Today, many people see questions of gender and sexuality. And perhaps all of them reveal something, but none of them tell the whole story. Here's what we actually know. Contemporary accounts describe Christina as different. She walked with long, confident strides. She preferred practical clothing. She often wore boots, riding coats, and garments associated with men. She rode astride rather than side saddle for her horse. Foreign ambassadors frequently commented on her deep voice, direct manner, and what one described as the bearing of a man. Now, before we go any further, we have to be careful because 17th century Europe didn't think about gender the same way we do today. The words we use now simply didn't exist. There wasn't a language for non binary, there wasn't a language for gender fluid. Even the idea of sexual identity as something fixed and personal was very different. So, historians have to resist a temptation, the temptation to force someone from the past into categories that belong in the present. That doesn't mean that those experiences didn't exist. Clearly, they did. Human beings haven't fundamentally changed, but the language people use to understand themselves certainly has. Christina herself once wrote that she possessed a man's soul. That's an extraordinary statement. What exactly did she mean? We don't know. Perhaps she meant she valued courage, learning, and independence, qualities her society associated with men. Perhaps she was expressing something deeper. We simply can't climb inside the mind of someone who died more than 3 centuries ago, and maybe that's okay. Sometimes history's mysteries deserve to remain mysteries. Then there was Ebba Spera. If Christina had one great love in her life, many historians believe it may have been Ebba. Christina affectionately called her Belle. Their surviving letters are filled with tenderness. She wrote of longing to see her, of missing her, of loving her. Read today, the letters feel intensely romantic. But here's where history becomes complicated again. In 17th century Europe, close emotional friendships, particularly between women, were often expressed in language that sounds remarkably intimate to modern readers. So were Christina and Ebba lovers? Maybe, maybe not. The evidence doesn't allow us to answer with certainty. What it does tell us is that Ebba mattered enormously to Christina. When Ebba eventually married another man, Christina's letters reveal unmistakable heartbreak. Whatever the exact nature of their relationship, losing Ebba hurt, and that's something almost everyone can understand. Looking back today, it's no surprise that many LGBTQ plus people have found inspiration in Christina's story. Here was someone who resisted expectations, someone who questioned prescribed roles, someone who insisted on living according to their own conscience, despite enormous social pressure. Whether Christina would recognize the words we use today, we'll never know. But the experience of feeling different, of searching for freedom to be yourself, of refusing to become the person everyone insists you must be, that experience is timeless. And perhaps that's why Christina still speaks to many people, not because she fits neatly into a modern category, but because she reminds us that human beings have always been more complicated than the categories we create. Before Christina became famous for walking away from power, she had to prove she deserved it. It's easy to forget that. Her abdication has become the defining image of her life. But for nearly a decade before that day at Uppsala Castle, she ruled, really ruled. When Christina officially assumed power in 1644, she was just 18 years old. Think back to yourself at 18. Maybe you were deciding what to study, looking for your first job, wondering what kind of life you wanted. Christina inherited one of Europe's great powers, and not everyone believed she was ready. Waiting for her was Axel Oxenstierna, the man who had governed Sweden during her minority, the architect of the Swedish Empire, a statesman with decades of experience, a man respected and feared across Europe. Imagine that first meeting, an 18-year-old queen across the table, one of the most experienced politicians on the continent. How many people expected him to continue making the real decisions? Probably most of Europe. Christina had other ideas. She listened, she learned, but she also challenged him. And nowhere was that disagreement more important than over the 30 Years' War. By the 1640s, Europe had been bleeding for a generation. It's difficult for us to appreciate the scale of that conflict. Imagine if World War II had lasted not 6 years, but 30. Imagine children being born into war, growing up in war, raising children during the same war. That's much of what Central Europe experienced. Entire regions were devastated, villages vanished, harvest failed, disease spread behind marching armies. Some German states lost a third of their population, others lost even more. This wasn't simply a war anymore, it had become a catastrophe. Oxenstierna wanted Sweden to press its advantage. The empire was winning. More victories meant more territory, more influence, better negotiating power. Christina looked at the same reports and saw something different. She saw exhaustion, empty coffers, soldiers who had spent their adult lives fighting, entire communities destroyed. Sweden had become a great power, but how much more blood was enough? It's one of those questions every generation asks. When does victory stop being worth its price? Christina believed that moment had arrived. She pushed for negotiations. It wasn't a popular position with everyone around her, but she held firm. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia finally brought the 30 Years' War to an end. Sweden emerged stronger than ever. It gained territories along the Baltic. It became one of the guarantors of the peace settlement. Its place among Europe's great powers was secure. Think about the irony. Gustavus Adolphus helped make Sweden a great power through war. Christina helped secure that greatness through peace. Father and daughter using entirely different weapons. And with the cannons finally silent, Christina turned to something she had loved even more than politics: ideas. She wanted Stockholm to become more than a military capital. She wanted it to become a place where Europe's greatest minds wanted to gather. She called it the Athens of the North. It's a remarkable ambition when you think about it. Athens wasn't remembered because of the size of its army. It was remembered because of philosophy, democracy, art, science. Christina understood something many rulers never do. Military victories eventually become chapters in history books. Ideas can shape civilizations. She invited artists, musicians, scholars, scientists. She purchased enormous collections of books and manuscripts. Her library became one of Europe's finest. Visitors to Stockholm no longer came to meet soldiers and generals. They came to debate philosophy with the Queen herself, which raises one of history's more amusing questions. If you're the most famous philosopher in Europe and the Queen of Sweden personally invites you to her court, do you say no? René Descartes didn't, and that decision would prove fatal. Christina has spent her entire life searching for people who would challenge her. That turns out to be surprisingly difficult when you are the queen. Think about it. If everyone bows when you enter the room, who tells you you're wrong? Who argues with you? Who says, "No, Your Majesty, I think you misunderstood"? Very few people. Power has a way of insulating us from disagreement. The higher someone rises, the fewer honest questions they tend to have. Christina hated that. She wasn't interested in flatterers, she wanted thinkers. And in the middle of the 17th century, there was one name that stood above everyone else: René Descartes. Today, most people know him for a single sentence: I think, therefore I am. But in his own lifetime, Descartes was much more than a philosopher. He was one of Europe's great intellectual celebrities. Kings wanted him, universities wanted him, scholars traveled hundreds of kilometers just to debate him. Christina wanted him in Stockholm, and after years of persuasion, he finally agreed. It's difficult to imagine the journey. A French philosopher leaving the relative comfort of the Dutch Republic, sailing north toward one of the coldest royal courts in Europe. Winter in Stockholm wasn't simply cold, it settled into your bones. Stone castles trap the damp. Fires help, but they rarely heated entire rooms. You learned to live with the cold. Descartes had not. Then Christina made one unusual request. She wanted philosophy lessons before sunrise, around 5 o'clock every morning. Now imagine you're Rene Descartes and you're in your 60s. You spent your career writing some of the most influential works of philosophy. You become accustomed to long mornings in bed, reading and thinking before beginning your day. Suddenly, you're waking long before dawn, pulling on layers of clothing, walking through dark corridors only lit by candles, your breath visible in the freezing air, because your 23-year-old queen can't wait until breakfast to debate metaphysics. It's almost funny until it isn't. Within a few months of arriving in Stockholm, Descartes became seriously ill. Traditionally, historians have believed he developed pneumonia, brought on by those pre dawn lessons. He died in February of 1650. More recently, some scholars have suggested other possibilities, including poisoning, though the evidence remains inconclusive. We simply don't know for certain, but whatever the cause, one of Europe's greatest minds was dead. Christina genuinely admired Descartes, yet there's something revealing about the whole episode. Her hunger for knowledge was relentless. She expected the people around her to match her pace. When she was awake before dawn, why shouldn't everyone else be? It's the kind of expectation brilliant people sometimes place on the world. They forget that not everyone is built the way they are. And then the story becomes even stranger. Descartes didn't really stay buried. His body was eventually returned to France, but not all of it. His skull remained separated from the rest of his remains. It passed from collector to collector, almost like a historical curiosity. His index finger also disappeared for a time. Imagine that, one of history's greatest philosophers reduced to souvenirs. Today, his skull rests in the Musée de Homme in Paris. His body lies elsewhere. Even in death, René Descartes never quite found peace. Christina would later move on to new philosophers, new ideas, new artists, but beneath all the intellectual excitement, another struggle had quietly been growing inside her. This one couldn't be solved through debate. It wasn't about reason, it was about faith, and eventually the question would cost her a crown. There comes a point in some people's lives when every road forward has a price. Christina had reached that point. On the surface, Sweden had never looked stronger. The war was over, the kingdom was respected across Europe. Stockholm was becoming a center of learning. Foreign ambassadors admired the young queen. From the outside, it looked like a success. But history has a habit of reminding us appearances can be deceiving. Because while Christina was filling her palace with books, another question had begun filling her mind: religion. We have to remember what religion meant in 17th century Europe. Today, for many people, faith is deeply personal. You choose your beliefs. You might never even discuss them outside your family. In Christina's world, religion wasn't just personal, it was political, national, existential. Europe had just spent 30 years tearing itself apart over religious divisions. Millions had died, cities had burned, entire generations knew almost nothing except war. Sweden wasn't just another Protestant country, it was the Protestant great power. And at the center of it all sat the daughter of Gustavus Adolphus, the man Protestants remember as their champion. Think about the weight of that inheritance. Christina wasn't simply expected to rule Sweden, she was expected to embody Lutheranism itself. Her personal beliefs weren't really supposed to matter. Her duty had already been decided for her. And yet, the more she read, the more questions she asked. Christina had always been curious. It was impossible for someone like her to read only one side of an argument. She studied Catholic theology, church history, the writings of the early church fathers, the great debates that had divided Christianity for centuries. At first, perhaps it was simply intellectual curiosity. But curiosity has a way of becoming conviction. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed. Christina found herself drawn towards Catholicism, not because it was fashionable, it certainly was not in Sweden, quite the opposite. She admired its philosophy, its sense of tradition, its art, its rituals, its mystery. Compared with the austere Lutheran court she had grown up in, Catholicism offered something emotionally and intellectually different. But here's the problem: a Swedish monarch could not become Catholic, not politically, not legally, not without destroying the very foundation of the kingdom. Under Swedish law, the sovereign had to be Lutheran. If Christina publicly converted while still queen, The constitutional crisis would have been enormous. Think about what that would have been. The daughter of the Lion of the North, the hero of Protestant Europe, kneeling before the Pope. It's difficult to imagine a more shocking headline in the 17th century, so she kept her questions to herself, or at least she tried. Quietly, Catholic priests began visiting Stockholm, not openly, that would have been impossible. They arrived discreetly, sometimes under assumed identities, sometimes presented as diplomats or scholars. Behind closed doors, Christina asked questions she couldn't ask anyone else about faith, about doubt, about salvation, about conscience. Imagine carrying that secret every public appearance, every church service, every meeting with bishops, knowing that if anybody truly understood what was happening inside your mind, everything would collapse. And here's where I think Christina's entire life begins to make sense. She hadn't only rejected marriage, she hadn't only resisted expectations about how a queen should behave. Now, even her faith no longer matched the role she had been born into. It's almost as though every part of her life was pulling in opposite directions. Duty on one side, conscience on the other. Eventually, something had to give. Christina realized that there was only one way to remain true to herself. She couldn't change Sweden. She couldn't change the law. She couldn't change what Europe expected of its Protestant queen, but she could remove herself from the equation. For years, she had been preparing to leave, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment. When it finally came, Europe could hardly believe what it was witnessing. A queen wasn't simply giving up a throne. She was giving up an empire for the sake of her conscience. June 6, 1654. For Christina, this day had been years in the making. Every argument, every sleepless night, every letter, every secret conversation, every prayer, every doubt, they had all led here. Uppsala Castle, the Hall of State. Imagine arriving that morning, servants moving quietly through stone corridors, boots echoing against the floors, nobles adjusting heavy velvet robes, bishops rehearsing the ceremony one last time. Outside, ordinary people gathering, hoping to catch a glimpse of history. Inside, almost no one knows what to say, because although everyone understands what's about to happen, no one has ever actually seen it before. Kings died, kings were overthrown, kings lost wars, but voluntary surrendering the throne, that almost belonged in the realm of fantasy. Christina entered wearing the full regalia of Sweden, the crown, the mantle, the scepter, the orb. Every piece represented something larger than herself: authority, responsibility, the continuity of the kingdom. For years, these objects almost become part of her body. And now, one by one, they were taken away. The crown was lifted first. Think about that moment. Since childhood, she's been told she belonged beneath that crown. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a destiny made visible. Then came the mantle, heavy, richly embroidered, a garment that announced to everyone in the room exactly who she was. It slipped from her shoulders. The scepter followed. Then the orb. Piece by piece, the Queen of Sweden disappeared until finally, standing in a simple white dress, there was only Christina. I find that image incredibly powerful because how often do we confuse the person with the position? Strip away the uniform, the title, the office. Who remains? That's the question facing Christina. She had prepared a farewell speech. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. At least she thought she did. Then she looked around the room at the people she had known since childhood, the advisors who had served her father, the nobles who had watched her grow into a queen, and suddenly words failed her. She broke down. Contemporary accounts tell us that she wept openly. This is a woman we've spent the last 8 chapters getting to know. Brilliant, defiant, fiercely independent. The woman who argued with philosophers, challenged chancellors, refused princes. Yet here, at this moment, she'd chosen for herself. She couldn't speak. I think that that's profoundly human. Sometimes people imagine courage as the absence of fear. History suggests it's something different. Courage is often making the difficult choice while feeling every ounce of its weight. Christina eventually gathered herself. She spoke only briefly. She thanked those who had served her, asked them to show the same loyalty to her successor, and then it was over. Carl Gustaf would become King Charles X Gustav. Sweden had a new monarch. Christina no longer had a country. Imagine walking out of that hall, every step carrying you further from the only life you've ever known. She wasn't going on a diplomatic visit. She wasn't leaving for a season. She was leaving forever. The forest, the northern winters, the language she had spoken since birth, her father's grave, the kingdom she spent her entire life preparing to rule, all of it fading behind her. History often tells us who won battles. It records treaties, coronations, successions. But moments like this are harder to measure. What does it mean to walk away from absolute power? We usually assume people will do almost anything to keep it. History gives us countless examples: civil wars, assassinations, coups, brothers killing brothers, fathers imprisoning sons, queens poisoning rivals, entire nations torn apart because someone refused to surrender a throne. Christina did the opposite. She gave it away, not because she had lost it, not because she'd been forced, but because she believed that there were things more important than power. Whether you agree with her reasons or not, that's extraordinary. Ahead of her lay Catholic Europe, Rome, a new faith, a new life, freedom, perhaps. But freedom has a price. Christina was about to discover that walking away from her crown doesn't mean leaving politics behind. Most stories end when the king leaves the throne. This one doesn't. In many ways, Christina's life was only beginning. Think about it. For 27 years, every decision she'd ever made had been shaped by one fact. She was Queen of Sweden. Now, suddenly, she wasn't. Imagine waking up in the morning after your entire identity disappears. No court waiting outside your door, no council demanding decisions, no ambassadors requesting audiences, no kingdom. Just you. That kind of freedom sounds wonderful until you actually have it, because freedom has an uncomfortable habit. It asks a question that power often hides: who are you now? Christina's journey south became something of a triumphal procession. Everywhere she stopped, crowds gathered. Some came out of curiosity, some out of admiration. Here was one of Europe's most famous women, traveling not as a reigning monarch, but as something entirely new: a queen by birth, a private citizen by choice. In Innsbruck, the secret she'd been guarding for years finally became public. On November 3rd, 1655, Christina formally embraced the Catholic faith. Imagine the shock that echoed across Europe. The daughter of Gustavus Adolphus, the man Protestants remember as the Lion of the North, had become Catholic. For the Vatican, this wasn't simply another conversion. It was a public relations victory of extraordinary importance. And when Christina finally reached Rome, she made sure the world noticed. Streets were decorated, bells rang, triumphal arches lined her route. Crowds filled the streets. The city welcomed her almost like a conquering hero. Think about the irony. Sweden had watched its queen leave. Rome welcomed a queen who no longer had a kingdom. But here's something I've always found fascinating. The Vatican expected gratitude, perhaps even obedience. Christina had spent her entire life proving she wasn't particularly good at obedience. She accepted Catholicism. She did not surrender her personality. She argued with cardinals. She questioned authority. She ignored etiquette when it suited her. She continued wearing clothing that made conservative observers uncomfortable. She surrounded herself with artists, musicians, philosophers, scientists, and writers long before her palace had become one of Rome's great intellectual salons. Once again, books found their way to the center of Christina's life. Looking back across her story, there's a pattern. Whenever she escaped one set of expectations, she built another world around ideas. That's where she seemed happiest, not commanding armies, not presiding over ceremonies, but sitting in a room filled with brilliant people asking impossible questions. Of course, Christina couldn't entirely escape politics. Former monarchs rarely can. At one point, she became involved in an ambitious plan to place her on the throne of Naples. It was daring, complicated, ultimately unsuccessful, but it reveals something important. Christina hadn't stopped thinking like a ruler. She had simply stopped ruling Sweden. And then there's one of the darkest moments in her life. In 1657, while staying at the Palace of Fontainebleau in France, Christina became convinced that one of her closest officials, Gian Ronaldo Montecchi, had betrayed her. She ordered him executed inside the palace without a formal trial. Think about that. Christina had given up a throne, but she still believed she possessed the authority of a sovereign. Europe was horrified. Many of her admirers struggled to defend what she had done. It's one of those moments that reminds us something important. History's most fascinating people are rarely simple. Christina could champion learning, admire philosophy, inspire generations, and still make decisions that leave us deeply uncomfortable. Human beings are contradictions. She was no exception. Christina spent the rest of her life in Rome, collecting books, supporting music, opera, and scholarship, welcoming some of Europe's greatest minds into her home. She died in 1689, 62 years old, nearly 35 years after leaving Sweden forever. And then came one final surprise. She was buried beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Think about how astonishing that is. The little girl raised to become the Protestant hope of Northern Europe now rested beneath the heart of Catholicism itself. Only a handful of women have ever received that honor. 400 years after her birth, visitors can still descend into the Vatican grottos. They stop before her tomb and they ask, and perhaps they ask the same question we've been asking through this episode: who exactly was Christina? Queen, scholar, rebel, convert, visionary, outcast? Maybe. Maybe she was all of them. 400 years have passed since Christina was born. Empires have risen, empires have fallen. Sweden is no longer a military superpower. The great castles of the 17th century have become museums. The arguments that once shook Europe now fill history books. And yet, we're still talking about Christina. Why? History is full of kings, kings who won battles, kings who conquered territory, kings whose names are remembered because they changed maps. Christina didn't really do that. She inherited an empire, she preserved it, she strengthened its reputation, then she walked away. That's a very strange legacy. Think about how we usually measure greatness: more land, bigger armies, longer reigns, more victories. Christina doesn't fit comfortably into any of those categories. Instead, her story asks a different question. What is power actually for? Is power something we hold on to no matter the cost? Or is there a point where remaining true to yourself becomes more important than keeping your position? Most rulers in history answer that question one way. Christina answered it another. That doesn't mean every decision she made was right, far from it. She could be stubborn, extravagant, impulsive, sometimes deeply unfair. Her execution of Monaldeschimi remains one of the darkest episodes of her life. Some of her financial decisions placed enormous strain on the Swedish treasury. Even many of her contemporaries struggle to understand her, and perhaps that's exactly why she's so fascinating. Truly interesting people are rarely simple. They refuse to fit neatly into categories. They leave behind contradictions instead of easy answers. Christina spent her entire life challenging expectations. As a child, she was educated like a prince. As a queen, she refused to marry. As a scholar, she questioned everything. As a believer, she followed her conscience even when it cost her the throne. She spent her entire life asking one question: who gets to decide who I am? Her family, her advisors, the church, society, or herself? We still ask that question today. Maybe that's why Christina feels so modern, not because she lived like someone from the 21st century. She didn't. She belonged completely to the 17th century. But the struggle between expectation and identity, between duty and conscience, between belonging and authenticity, those are timeless. Every generation inherits them. Every generation has to answer them. History doesn't always give us heroes. Sometimes it gives us people who are brilliant, frustrating, courageous, contradictory, and deeply human. Christina was one of those people. She wasn't remembered because she ruled the longest. She wasn't remembered because she conquered the most territory. She's remembered because she made one of the most extraordinary choices any monarch has ever made. She looked at the most powerful thrones in Europe and decided it wasn't worth losing herself. Whether you admire that decision or disagree with it, it's difficult not to respect the courage it took. Because here's the thing, most of us will never wear a crown, most of us will never command armies. Most of us will never shape the fate of nations, but all of us at some point in our lives will face a moment when who we are collides with who the world expects us to be. Christina's story reminds us that those moments aren't new. They've always been part of the human experience. 400 years later, that's why her story matters. Christina left Sweden believing she was leaving her old life behind. In many ways, she was. But history has a funny way of deciding what it remembers. It remembers the battlefield where her father fell. It remembers the throne she abandoned. It remembers the church where she found her new faith. But I wonder if that's really her greatest legacy. Maybe it wasn't the crown she wore or the crown she gave away. Maybe it was the courage to choose conviction over comfort, to accept that living honestly sometimes means walking away from everything that's familiar. It's not just a 17th century story, it's a human story. 400 years later, we're still wrestling with the same questions. Who am I? Who do other people expect me to be? And what am I willing to sacrifice to remain true to myself? If you ever find yourself in Uppsala Castle, pause for a moment in the Hall of State. Imagine the candles, the silence, the weight of the crown being lifted away. Or if your travels take you to Rome, step into St. Peter's Basilica and descend into the Vatican grottos. There, beneath one of the world's most famous churches, rests the woman who was born to defend Protestant Europe and chose a completely different path. It's a reminder that history is rarely simple. The people who shaped it almost never are. And maybe that's why we keep coming back to stories like Christina's. Not because they give us easy answers, but because they remind us that the people of the past struggle with the same questions we ask today. They loved, they doubted, they made mistakes, they searched for meaning, just like we do. Next time on Beyond the Swedish Postcard, we'll leave philosophy behind and return to the battlefield. Sweden has a new king, King Karl X Gustav, and within a few years, he'll make one of the boldest military decisions in European history. Faced with an enemy on the other side of the water, he'll do something almost unimaginable. He'll march an army across a frozen sea. Until then, thank you for spending this time with me. Whether you're listening from Sweden or somewhere else in Europe or from the United States, or from somewhere else in the world, I'm grateful that you're here exploring the stories with me. History isn't just about dates and kings, it's about people. And every person has a story worth telling. Until next time, keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard. Tack so mycket for listening, and hej då for now.